How does the knight move?
Shit. Oh, my rook. What am I doing?
The rook! The bishop! The queen!
So, for the first rule we'll be examining is castling. So castling is a special rule as you can move two pieces simultaneously. However, there are some rules. So first of all, castling is done with the king and the rook. So, firstly, the lane needs to be cleared. If there's a piece blocking in the way, you can no longer castle. So in this case, because the bishop is in the way, you would need to move before it'd be eligible to castle. Now, how does castling work? Castling is when the king moves 2 squares over and the rook jumps over. Hence why we can't really have a piece in the way. We would capture it when we're moving our king. So what this means is we can move 2 squares over and castle. This is valid. Now, it is critical to note that castling cannot be done all the time. For example, castling cannot be done when our king is in check, meaning if this bishop is attacking our king, we can't castle out of check. This would just be a bit too unfair as there would be no reason not to. Also, you can't castle through check, meaning here we would be unable to castle through here because our king goes 1, 2, and then the rook hops over. Now, a neat exception to this is it's our king that has to be in the way. So for example here, even though this bishop is controlling this b1 square, first of all, beginners may think that we move our king 3 squares and jump over. So castling is not allowed. However, castling is allowed here because our king only moves 2 squares and our rook jumps over, which leads our king nowhere where it could be checked. But if the bishop was here, we couldn't because our king would be castling into a check, and here it would be castling through check. So the way to think about it is, can my king go to d1 safely? Can my king go to c1 safely? If both are yes, then we can castle. But there are a few more niche rules to castling. So first of all, let's just see it when we go out of the analysis board and into the board editor. So let's say here we want to castle. We could castle short, long, that's all legal. However, once we move a rook, let's say both of us move a rook, we cannot castle short. This is not allowed. Mainly because, well, our rook's moved. How are we going to castle? Now you might say, well, fine, we'll just put our rooks back in place. However, here we still cannot castle because once your rook is moved, you cannot castle on that side. Now, this does not stop us, of course, from castling on the other side. This is legal. However, this is not legal. You cannot castle short. Now, let's see here what other rules there are. Once you moved your king, you can no longer castle at all. So let's say here we moved our king. No more castling options. We can't castle. Why? Because our king already moved. We can't have castling then. So that pretty much sums up castling. So, for the next rule we'll be covering promotion. So, if you've been paying attention diligently in the last few episodes, you'll know that a pawn moves forward, can move 2 squares on the first, and moves up the board. Now, you might be wondering, well, what happens to a pawn when it gets to the last row? Seeing as it can only move forward, either diagonally when it's capturing or just forward to move, you would wonder what happens to it on last rank. Is it like checkers where it gets some sort of special power? Well, sort of. When you get your pawn to the end, you'll be prompted with an option to make a new piece. This means your pawn can be converted into a bishop, rook, knight, or queen. Generally speaking, queen or rook are preferred as they're worth more points than a bishop or a knight. For example, a bishop on its own or a knight on its own, as we talked about, isn't enough material to checkmate. So you're going to need to make a queen if you want to go for the win. Generally speaking, when I see people promote, they promote to a queen. However, there are special occasions where it might be more beneficial to promote to other pieces, which we'll talk about in later episodes of the series. So, for the next segment, we're going to be talking about the most complicated rule in chess, en passant. Part of my French speakers. So, what is en passant? En passant means in French, in passing. Basically, your pawns are in passing, and yeah, that's what the rule is named for some reason. Anyways, so how do we use this? So, first of all, we need to remember the basics. If our pawn goes forward 1 square, our opponent can take it. Makes sense? Seems easy enough. But then, en passant is extending this, basically saying, what happens if your opponent's pawn moves 2 squares? Basically saying here, can we still take it? Now, the normal rules of chess without en passant would say no. However, en passant does in fact allow us to take it, but there are some limitations. The first limitation is, we can't wait a move, our opponent waits a move, now we cannot take it, this is not an option. And you might be saying, well that's stupid, why is it not an option anymore? Imagine I just put another piece there. You can't stack kill pieces, that would be completely broken. Another thing, if you move your pawn up 1 square, and then you move it another square, you lose en passant, because you had the option to take it. The whole point of en passant was, people were saying, when pawns gained the right to move 2 squares forward, that it would suck for a pawn who had already made a bunch of squares, 2 full moves, or in the old time 3 moves, for another pawn to just zoom by it, and now this pawn is stuck because it never got the chance to take this pawn, versus in the old rules it would have. So they added this extra option where for 1 turn, you could in fact take this pawn. This is en passant. So let's see some more examples. Let's say white wastes their move, and then black pushes. Here, we can en passant with the A pawn, or the B pawn. Or the C pawn, sorry. Then, here's the thing. What else can we do with en passant? Well, en passant pretty much lets us do whatever we want, within the bounds that I just said. For example, if we move this H pawn, we can en passant. And sometimes en passant makes a big difference. As we saw here, it went from completely winning, with checkmate in 15 moves if white plays correctly, to completely losing, with minus 13, which is dead lost, even checkmate in 15. But why? Well, this allows our opponent to go for a queen. As we learn in promotion, this is a big problem. So, we'll learn further about pawn endgames like this one, but it's critical to understand the importance of en passant. It also however, unlike the memes suggest, you do not have to take en passant just because you can. And sometimes that's a big difference between an alright player and an excellent player. The bad player will just instantly en passant without thinking. But a good player or a great player might instead consider, should I en passant? Not just can I en passant.